Welcome to Story Blend. My wife and parents think I came home after going missing, but it isn't me. I'm writing this down because I want to leave something behind. Some kind of testimony, because I don't know what's going to happen to me. Please forgive any formatting errors. I'm typing this on my phone. I want you to understand, so that's why I'm telling the whole story from start to finish, or at least where I think it all started. I don't know what's happening to me, or whether I'm still even here. Maybe this will help someone if they encounter the same thing I did. Whatever you do, if you see the tower, stay away. Back in the summer of 2024, my dad and I were out walking the south. Downs in the UK, we've done a variation of this walk We normally have a fixed route. Go up a particular road, turn right, walk past an old Iron Age fort, then loop back. It's about 4 miles in all across slightly hilly terrain. This time around, we decided to turn left. We don't normally go this way because, honestly, it always seemed like a more boring route. Why would you go on the route that map doesn't always include an Iron Age fort? After all? Anyway, we started along this new route, and for a while the walk was pretty boring. We were walking an exposed ridgeline, getting buffeted by wind, and the view was no better or worse than our normal route. Still, we kept going. We were both desperate for some fresh air, and actually ended up walking further than normal. I think maybe 3 or 4 miles in a single direction before we started to think about turning back. There were rain clouds on the horizon, and we'd be retracing our steps as there was no way to turn this walk into a loop without having to go along main roads with lots of traffic. Besides, we'd reached a natural end to the walk. We were at the edge of the ridgeline now, looking out across a valley through which ran a relatively busy road. Across the other side of the valley, the ground rose sharply into a hill, topped with a small patch of woodland and a huge radio mast. We were able to look up the mast later. It's just a commercial radio tower serving the local area. Nothing military or weird. I'd guess the hill was a mile distant from where we were standing. My dad's a keen bird watcher and had brought along a pair of binoculars. He started looking out at the other hill and said something like, "That's a grand old place up there. Have a look." He pointed to the hill opposite and handed me the binoculars. I aimed them in the direction indicated and was surprised to see a very old red brick tower, partially covered by the edge of the woodland. It would have had a commanding view of the countryside below, but it didn't look military. It looked like it had been built in either the 1500s or 1600s and was part of a church or manor house. It was difficult to see what condition it was in from where we were, but we were both absolutely intrigued by it. We'd looked at an old ordnance survey map of the area before, and neither of us could remember seeing any churches or major buildings on that hill, with the exception of the radio mast, obviously. We both love history, and seriously contemplated clambering down the ridge, crossing the road, and climbing up the other side to look at the tower. But as I say, the weather wasn't looking great. The road was busy, and we had a fairly long walk across bad terrain to get back to the car. So we agreed we'd go back the following weekend, park the car at the base of the hill where the tower was located, and head up to explore. So the following weekend, we walked up the hill, past a small caravan site and past the radio mast, which was fenced and gated off, but it looked pretty boring. We couldn't see a path that'd lead us to the tower, so we had to go by memory and work out the rough direction we'd need to head. In the end, it involved walking through brambles and undergrowth, and thickest part of the wood. But we made it. In front of us was a substantial red brick tower, perhaps 25 meters tall, or around 80 feet, for those of you who don't use metric. It looked old, maybe Tudor, so 1500s, and was partially ruined. We could see that the top of it had crumbled a little. From our angle, we couldn't really see the roof, but we guessed it must have fallen in at least, partially based on the state of the rest of it. Having said all that, the rest of it looked well preserved, especially given that there were no paths to it, meaning, presumably, that no one carried out any kind of regular maintenance on the place. We walked around the base of the tower. It was square, maybe 10 meters by 10 meters, or 30 feet by 30 feet. And there were no windows on the ground floor, or first floor, for my American readers, but there was one on each side from the second story up, for a total of 4 stories including the first floor. We found a door. It was fairly large, A little taller than me, I'm about 6'2", and in surprisingly good condition. I'd honestly expected the door to be rotted or partially collapsed. It looked old, sure, but it was still intact, and its hinges were solid. Looking at my dad, I shrugged, braced myself against the red brick door frame, and gave the door a shove with my shoulder. It ground open, the door catching a little, but we were able to go in. The first thing I did was look up. I didn't want anything to fall on my head. The floors above us had partially collapsed, and I could see daylight shining through a pretty significant hole in the roof. The place smelled damp and old, and, to our disappointment, there wasn't much to see. The floor was well-compacted earth and chunks of wood from the collapsed floors. There was no furniture. We took a look around. I snapped some photos with my phone of the interior, the roof, and the exterior, and we chatted about what we thought it had been. Our guesses ranged from a folly, a kind of mock castle built for decoration, but those had become popular in the 18th and 19th century, and this tower was too old for that. Or part of an old manor house. But then where was the rest of it? Or an old hunting lodge? It definitely wasn't an old church tower. It didn't look right for that, and there was no evidence of any kind of religious decoration. We were about to leave when I spotted some graffiti by the door. The old graffiti carved into the brick, not sprayed with paint, which you tend to see here in England when you visit really old churches or other buildings. It was a circle, etched perfectly with a compass or chisel into the brickwork. Inside the circle was what looked like a flower, 6 petals, emanating from a central point, each perfectly shaped and uniform in size. We thought it had to be graffiti because, and I don't know how we could tell exactly, it didn't look decorative. It looked like this had been carved a little later, and the way it cut across the bricks and mortar, without regard for what looked aesthetically pleasing. I don't know. It looked unplanned, plus it was off-center from the door, and there were no similar patterns anywhere else in the tower. I took a photo of it, planning to look it up later and maybe reverse image search it. We left without incident and spent the car journey home, theorizing about what it might have been. I remember picking red dust out from under my fingernails. It must have got under there when I braced against the bricks. As I pushed the door open, my nails looked worn, more so than usual, and one hurt as though I'd bent it back without realizing. Clumsy, but I get like that when I'm excited. I was the sort of kid who fell over, scraped their knee without realizing, and only started crying when someone pointed out to me that I'd hurt myself. When we got back, we searched Google for information on the tower, looked up some old maps, and were genuinely bemused that we could find no sign of the place either online or on the old maps. That struck as being very odd. It was a big enough building that you'd think, as someone would have photographed it at some point, written a blog, or marked it on a map. The radio tower was there, and so was the caravan site. There were photos of the hill taken from the ridge my dad and I had been stood on, but the brick tower was nowhere to be seen. I have to admit, even at that point, my dad and I were weirded out. England is a small country, and stuff like this is almost always documented by someone, somewhere. Honestly, my next step was going to be posting some pictures on Reddit. I was in the middle of doing so, in fact, when I realized the photos I'd taken were gone, as if they'd never even been taken. Nothing on the cloud or in my recycling bin, nothing. I told my dad about it, and I think we both tried to reassure ourselves that it was a technical glitch, but neither of us was convinced, not really. Not after our fruitless search for the tower online. All this made us more intrigued than ever, though. Maybe the place had been totally covered in trees until very recently, and some recent logging work had revealed it for the first time in decades. That seemed like a reasonable explanation, and we decided we'd head back the following weekend with my wife, sister, and brother-in-law. We all like history and the outdoors, and the others would, we sure, be fascinated by the place. So we went back, parked the car in the same place as before, retraced our steps as precisely as we could, and the tower wasn't there. As in, there wasn't even a clearing in the undergrowth, just brambles, undergrowth, and trees. We were sure we'd gone wrong somewhere, so we wandered, carefully, together around the woods as thoroughly as possible. Nothing. My wife, sister, and brother-in-law found it funny at first, and then got bored traipsing through the trees and asked if we could head back. But I have to admit, my dad and I started to feel a little panicked. My dad, who never swears, asked me quietly, "Where the fuck is it?" Adam Ed's not my real name? Why can't we find it? I had an idea. Let's drive over to the other side of the valley, where we originally saw the tower, and see if we can see it from there. So that's what we did, and there was still no sign of the tower. My wife, who had originally found this all slightly amusing, now looked concerned, as if she was wondering whether my dad and I were all right. I was starting to wonder the same thing. We dropped everyone else back home, and I explained to my wife that I was going to stay behind with my dad. She said she understood. I think she knew that my dad and I had been rattled by the whole thing. I was grateful that she didn't think. We'd made it all up. I'd told her about the photos, described the tower, everything. And my dad, who isn't given to bullshitting, had corroborated everything I said. I think she was a little unnerved by it, whether because she thought we'd encountered something paranormal, or because she thought her husband and father-in-law had experienced some kind of shared delusion. I'm not sure. I don't know what prompted me to do this. But I suggested to my dad that we look up the carving we'd seen on the door. In England, it's not all that uncommon, in very old houses and buildings, to find the mummified corpses of cats or buried bottles, filled with weird ingredients, intended to ward away evil. You can look this up, it's absolutely true. Remember, England had seen its fair share of witch hunts in centuries past. These beliefs went back a long way, so that's what I started looking for. I didn't really know what to Google, but after searching various permutations of witch carving evil ward England, I came up with a result that made my blood run cold, the exact symbol my dad and I had seen, a circle with those petals inside. It was called, apparently, a witch sign, and they were intended to ward away evil. Now, I've stayed in a hotel before that literally had a mummified cat in it. They had it on display behind glass, and had found it buried under the floor years ago while doing renovation. I hadn't been scared then because I wrote it off as a relic of an old superstition. To me, it was a fascinating, if morbid, artifact, nothing more. But now seeing this mark with fresh eyes, and having experienced what my dad and I had experienced, I shuddered. I called my dad over and showed him the result. The first thing he said was, "Well, they were able to take photos of those signs and they didn't disappear. So why did yours?" It was a fair observation. What was different about the place we'd visited? Was the sign just a coincidence? And to be honest, I still wasn't sure whether we'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the radio mast had beamed some kind of bizarre, brain-altering signal into our heads. But then it hadn't happened to my wife, sister, and brother-in-law. And besides, there was a caravan park right next to the mast. If it was making people hallucinate, entire buildings, I'd imagine the people staying at the caravan site would have noticed. I spoke to my dad about going back to the tower again, but he didn't want to. I think the whole thing had shaken him up. I could tell the mental shutters were coming down. He was starting to file this experience, away under just forget about it. Thinking about this will lead to dark places. It was a technique he'd picked up over a tough childhood, and it was not a technique I was familiar with. For me, all that was left was curiosity. I asked my wife if she'd go with me, but she said no. There's nothing there. I think she was being protective. She could tell this had got under my skin, and was trying to get me to leave it alone. I wish I'd listened to her because from here, things get blurry for me. You'll see what I mean. I left it for a couple of weeks and tried to take my wife's advice. I went to work during the week. We did chores and shopped at the weekends, saw my parents, and didn't mention the tower. But in the back of my mind, I kept seeing that sign and the tower. I kept thinking, was it really there? What had I seen? Was this all in my head? And if it was, did I need to see a doctor? So, I did what every idiot character in a horror movie does. I went back alone. But to give me some credit, I told my wife exactly where I was going. I went on a sunny day at 10 a.m. on Saturday morning, 12th August 2024. I packed food, colored ribbons to mark my path, a torch, flashlight, a first aid kit, and my phone. I knew there was a signal up there, so that wasn't a concern. I also brought an old camera that belonged to my mum, which used film. I wrote a note in large lettering explaining who my car belonged to, where I was going, and included both my wife and my dad's phone number, which I left on the dashboard of my car when I parked it at the entrance to the woods. On the hill where my dad and I had first parked, I thought I was being thorough. I got out of the car and started walking. I could remember the route, even through the undergrowth. I'd been thinking about little else for the past month. Even so, I tied colored ribbons to the trees as I went, marking my route so that I'd find my way there and back if I ever wanted to bring someone else. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, scraping myself on thorns. But I found it. It was there. Just like the first time I'd seen it, unchanged. I almost wept, as much with relief as anything else. I hadn't or imagined it. This place existed. It was real. I wasn't going mad. I took out my mom's camera and began to snap pictures, walking around the tower, taking photos from various angles. I tried to call my dad, but it went to voicemail. I tried my wife, and the same thing happened. I remember feeling a flutter of unease at that. The signal was good up here, and I'd told both of them where I was going. I had hoped they'd have their phones with them. But I put it to the back of my mind. They might both have been busy, so I'd try them again in a few minutes. I went to the door of the tower and pushed it open. It was the same as I'd first found it, the same smell, the same uneven floor. I took more photos with the camera and then, before I left, aimed the camera at the witch mark by the inside of the door, and I froze. The witch mark was crisscrossed with scratches and scrapes, distorted almost to the point that it was unrecognizable, like someone rabid had attacked it. I remembered the red dust caught under my fingernails as we drove home, the nail that had been bent back. With a sick sense of realization, I understood that Narao had done this. I had no memory of it, none at all, but I was certain. This was my handiwork. I couldn't stay a second longer. I had to leave. The fact that I'd defaced that sign and not realized was enough to convince me that there was something wrong with me. I needed to speak to a doctor. I honestly wasn't even worried about anything supernatural. It simply terrified me that I'd done something like that and hadn't remembered it afterwards. I opened the door and stepped out into almost pitch-black darkness. It had been bright daylight when I first entered. I must have been in that tower for almost 10 hours, but it felt like minutes. I think I began to hyperventilate. I took my phone out to check the time. It was 11 p.m. The palms of my hands started to sweat, and my eyes began to sting with panicked tears. Something was very medically wrong with me, I thought. I had several missed calls, all from my wife. I called her back, and she picked up almost immediately. She sounded like she was angry, and that she'd been crying. "Where the fuck are you, Adam? Where have you been? Are you all right?" I tried to explain that I was at the tower, that it existed after all, but that I'd lost time and that I needed help. "How can you be at the tower? How did you even get there?" I didn't know what she meant. My mind was reeling. I drove. "I set off this morning, remember?" I reminded her. "Adam, that's impossible. The car is still in the driveway." "It's been here for days. You've been gone for 2 days without saying anything to us. We had to call the police. We reported you as a missing person. Your parents and I have been worried sick. Your dad's been looking for you up that fucking hill. How could you do this? Are you okay? How—" She paused. I heard her shouting to my parents. They must have come over to our house to be with her. She sounded excited. "Adam, what do you mean you're at the tower? I can see you walking up the driveway now." The call was cut off by a screech of interference. I tried to call back once, twice, over and over, but the calls wouldn't connect. I looked up from the screen. I couldn't see anything. The brightness of the screen had killed my vision in this darkness. I fumbled for the torch in my rucksack and switched it on. I believe I screamed aloud. Every single tree around me had a ribbon tied around it. Dozens, hundreds of trees, each with a ribbon. The brambles rose thick around the tower. I couldn't see where I had come from, where the route back began or ended. I stumbled into the undergrowth, reaching out to touch the trees and the ribbons, as if proving to myself that they were real. I grasped a bramble with my hand, hard enough to draw blood. I did it, I think, simply to convince myself that this was real. I walked through the undergrowth for hours. I wept. I was lost. Physically, mentally, I didn't know anymore. I tried to walk in a straight line. The woods weren't large, an acre at most. I figured I'd reach the edge in just minutes, but the edge never came. Instead, hours later, I found myself back at the base of the tower. My torch flickered. The battery must have been getting low. I slumped down beside the door of the tower. And here I still am, typing all this out. I like the story. Like, comment, and share it for new videos.